Good morning and peace be upon you this beautiful day, wherever you're tuning in from. My name is Qasim Rashid, and this is the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126, the most awesome show, the multiverse. We got a great show lined up today. Alec Karakatsanis is here. He's a civil rights lawyer, award-winning civil rights lawyer, author of a new book called Copaganda: How Police and the Media Manipulate Our News. And I have to say, I can't put this book down. I consider myself pretty well informed on these issues of media misinformation, on police violence. And this book is just a new level of awareness that this stuff goes far deeper than I thought possible. And Alec is going to talk about the motivation behind this book, how to recognize propaganda, and what we can do to play a more meaningful role to uphold basic justice, basic humanity in this country. We're also going to talk about the new Pope, who is from my city, Chicago. Pope Leo the 14th hails from Chicago, Illinois. He's a Peruvian American, and I'm deeply interested in this Pope for a number of reasons. We are obviously at a time of deep political division, escalating global crisis, and Pope Leo, Pope Francis was pretty well beloved by most. I'm not saying everybody loved him, but he was beloved by most. And in fact, I think the left liked him more than the right. I think Pope Leo is going to be in a similar boat. He's emerging as a powerful advocate for justice, for humanity, for moral clarity. He has great stances on combating gun violence, protecting immigration rights, abolishing the death penalty, climate justice. And let's be clear, and because I'm going to keep it 100, his views on abortion are still deeply problematic in my view. He's called to defund abortion care, abortion health care. And given what we know about how abortion bans harm women, I'm hopeful that he'll at least have the compassion to, while maintaining his personal moral standard to whatever he wants, I hope he has a compassion to stop with the abortion bans, because we know they don't actually work. And so what I did, because I'm a nerd, I read his entire Twitter history, all of it. And so later in the show, I'll go through what I learned by reading his entire Twitter history and share that with you guys. When we come back from break, we are going to have Alec Karakatsanis, as I mentioned, brilliant civil rights lawyer who has written this phenomenal new book, Copaganda: How Police and the Media Manipulate Our News. You're listening to the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. If you're listening on Substack, make sure you hit that subscribe button so we can continue to create this advocacy. Need and welcome your support. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back. You're listening to the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. I'm extraordinarily excited about our guest this week. Alec Karakatsanis is the founder of Civil Rights Corp, as an organization that challenges the systemic injustice in the U.S. legal system. He has been recognized as the 2016 Trial Lawyer of the Year by Public Justice for his landmark work on constitutional rights. He's the author of Usual Cruelty: The Complicity of Lawyers in the Criminal Injustice System. And he's here to talk about his new book, Copaganda: How Police and the Media Manipulate Our News. Alec, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Definitely a pleasure. I've followed your work for a long time, as somebody who is in the civil rights and human rights space myself, but not nearly as accomplished as you. I've looked at your scholarship as something that's sorely needed, and something that I wish more law schools taught, that more universities in general taught. Reading your book, I think what struck me is two things. One, how little scholarship there is in this space. I mean, you are literally leading the charge in this space of propaganda, and I'm going to ask you to define the word for our audience in a second. And two, how much there actually is in this. I consider myself more informed than the average person in this space because I study this stuff for a living. But literally every page, I found myself thinking, my God, I never even thought about that angle. That's such a fantastic perspective and framing to look at it. So thank you for this. Let's start with just a very basic, obvious question. What is your origin story of why you decided to write Copaganda? What happened that made you say, hey, this book needs to be written. We need to educate the public on this information?
We were doing these really important civil rights cases all over the country, and we were winning. We were getting hundreds of thousands of people out of jail cells solely because they were poor, they couldn't pay debt, or they owed cash bail before they were convicted of anything. We were helping to reunite families who were separated from their children and parents just because they were poor and couldn't afford to pay. And the more work we did around the country winning these cases, the more I started to study the way the media was talking about these cases and how oftentimes it was using the system's own failures and its own violence and, frankly, its own profit to actually justify responding to our cases and our civil rights wins to kind of recreate the same systems of suffering and oppression, but using new labels. That's what
Yeah.
actually got me into it a little bit,
Mm.
was looking at how a lot of these systems persist. You can go look in the local news and the newspapers 150 years ago, 120 years ago, 90 years ago, 70 years ago. You can see a lot of the same problems with police brutality, deaths in jail and prison, horrific injustice and inequality and racism and all of these things. And I got kind of obsessed, frankly, with studying how the mainstream news frames those problems in a way that leads people to keep accepting so-called solutions that don't actually fix the problems and indeed make them worse. And for me, the 2020 uprisings were a huge turning point. There was this incredible energy around the country, people saying, you know what? Um, all of these solutions that you're pitching to us after the Watts uprisings and the Rodney King uprisings and the Michael Brown uprisings in Ferguson, all of these solutions, more money for the cops, better training, more technology for the police, you know, um, all of these things that are being pitched, right? They're not actually making the police any less violent. They're not
Yeah.
actually making the police more effective. In fact, people started thinking, well, maybe the purpose of the punishment bureaucracy isn't public safety, but something else. Maybe its purpose is to perpetuate distributions of wealth and power, and its purpose is to control people who are the most vulnerable people in our society. And that reaction, there was that movement. People were in the streets, and
Yeah.
over half the country in a poll said they supported the burning of the Minneapolis police precinct
Yeah.
in the days
54%.
after.
That was wild. Yeah.
That scared people, and I started documenting the pushback and the reaction, the incredible efforts that so many mainstream news outlets, university professors, nonprofits, and others on the so-called liberal left progressive, the way that they tried to crush any movement for people to understand that we might be able to make our society more safe and solve our problems of violence in our society, not through the punishment bureaucracies. That's kind of how I started writing about this particular topic.
And we see examples of that already in the 2025 Trump regime, where obviously critical pieces of legislation under the previous administration, like the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, were blocked, weren't passed. But suddenly, a couple of Tesla dealerships burned down, and they want to start charging people with terrorism for destroying property, and they have law enforcement standing full gear, full SWAT gear in front. I want to point to there's a default, I think, by some folks on the left on this issue of more police equals more safety. And there's no data that actually supports that. And part of the problem is that there's no way to argue for public safety in a way that people won't get offended regarding law enforcement. And let me explain what I mean by that. Let's say crime is super high and there's mass theft and murders. The argument is, well, we need more police to keep us safe, so let's increase police funding. On the flip side, if crime drops significantly and there's low murder and low rape and low theft, then the argument is, well, police are doing a great job. let's give them more money so they can keep doing a great job, right? There's no argument there. There's no way to say that maybe we should invest in public funding, in public safety, as opposed to more armed agents on the street. And the example you bring up at the start of your book is one that I fully confess I did not see coming. It hit me like a sucker punch when you talk about this individual named Chris Swanson, Genesee County Sheriff, who spoke at the DNC for the nomination of Kamala Harris. I was at the DNC. I remember this person speaking, and it talked about how he, put down his weapon and he walked with the protesters of Flint after the George Floyd murder. And then there's a backstory about him that people don't know. What is that backstory?
Yeah, so I think his story is really important for understanding the enormous gap between the image of the punishment bureaucracy. And I say punishment bureaucracy because I don't use the term criminal justice system. I don't want to give people the sense that either its goal or its effect is to do justice. Similarly, as I explain in the book, the term law enforcement is a term of propaganda. They started using that word at a time when they were trying to rebrand themselves as about safety, right? Because obviously the origins of the policing system were in catching enslaved people and then crushing striking laborers. They rebranded as the 20th century went on toward being about public safety, and they want you to think that a law is broken, it must be enforced. When in reality, people like Swanson, which I'll get to in a minute, police and prosecutors and courts, they're only enforcing some laws against some people some of the time for some reasons.
Right.
And there are enormous biases in who the law gets enforced. It's why there's drug raids in poor Black neighborhoods, but not on the campus of Yale University or wealthy boarding schools. But I think this story, this captures this chasm between how the punishment bureaucracy portrays itself, the image, and the reality. So we were representing, hundreds of thousands of people over the last decade in jails across the country, trying to get them out of jail because they were there solely because their families lacked cash. The United States and the Philippines are the only two countries in the world that have a for-profit commercial money bail industry that decides.
Say that part again, because I don't think people realize how devastating that is. 200 plus nations on Earth. The US and the Philippines are the only two that have a for-profit prison industry, a cash bail industry. That's wild to me.
Yeah, so those are the only two countries where when you're arrested in much of the country here in the US, you're told you're free to go home to your child, to your parent, to your job, to your medication, to your pet who may be alone and starving in your apartment, to your church, whatever it is, you're free to go home, but only if this company offers you a non-refundable payment to front the money that the court has set for your release.
Incredible.
And it's really it's unconstitutional. It's incredible, but it is the way that we do things in this country, other than in some of the places where we've been able to accomplish some bail reform. So, those are the people that fill Sheriff Chris Swanson's jail. Okay, and all over the country, people in jail started telling us, you know what? In many of our jails, we're no longer allowed to visit with our children. They've ended the free family visits. And we started looking at that. It didn't make any sense to us, right? Because actually, it turns out contact between child and parent is one of the best things you can do to prevent future crime. Keeping people connected as families is actually how you lower crime in the future. So we started looking into it, and it turned out all these sheriffs across the country were signing contracts with the private equity-owned prison and jail telecom industry. And the industry had this theory, which was if you stop people from visiting for free with their kids, their families will be forced to spend more money on various forms of calling, phone and video call, that they can charge monopoly rates. They lock in these contracts that charge you exorbitant rates to do like a choppy video call that often doesn't work, or a phone call with your loved one. That all of them are recorded. You have no privacy. People with disabilities have trouble using them, right? And in many places, it's impossible. There's no accommodation. Anyway, but how do we get sheriffs to stop doing this? Well, they decided to cut the sheriffs in on the profit. So sheriffs like Swanson signed these lucrative deals with their jail where they ended in-person family visits, profits go up, and then they all get a cut of it. So I was watching the Democratic National Convention. It was really interesting to me because at the same time that was happening, I'm representing all these children in Flint along with my colleagues, and we're suing Swanson and we're suing the private
Wow.
equity firms. And the owner of the largest of these companies is also the owner of the Detroit Pistons, and he's also from Flint. Now he lives in Beverly Hills, I think. But these are the people that are profiting off of family separation.
Yeah.
And to me, that's a really good example of how what's portrayed in the media about the purpose and function of things like a jail or a sheriff or a police is so different than reality. Like these policies across the country are not being adopted because there's any scientific evidence that separating children from their parents does anyone any good. They're being adopted to make money.
If you're just tuning in, we're speaking with Alec Karakatsanis. He's at Equality Alec across social media. And I'm grateful for you to break that down, Alec, because I think oftentimes we forget that injustice there's no party that's monopolized injustice. And I want to be careful. I'm not saying that Democrats and Republicans are the same. I think we're seeing some massive fascism from the right. That doesn't excuse situations like what happened here, where you have a person, a sheriff, who is profiting off of human exploitation, celebrated for it, literally given a stage at the DNC to talk about the importance of justice and the Constitution and due rights. Meanwhile, he's literally selling disproportionately Black and brown bodies for profit. It's mind-boggling. It's modern-day slavery by any other name. Obviously, you mentioned the new Jim Crow at the start of your book by Dr. Michelle Alexander, a landmark book published in 2009 about the for-profit and mass incarceration system. And this is effectively a new way to profit off of people from below income backgrounds, people disproportionately from Black and Latino backgrounds. You also make a great contrast, Alec, and I want you to talk about this, between the reasons of like who benefits from propaganda, and then you provide kind of 3 or 4 roles: narrowing our understanding of the threat, manufacturing fear, and promoting punishment as the solution. Talk about that. What do you mean when you say narrowing our understanding of the threat?
So this is really where we get into like the definition, or at least my definition, my personal definition of Copaganda. What do I mean? Why did I write this book about this topic? What am I actually talking about? So the first thing it does that I think is really important to understand is it narrows our understanding of what we even think of as safety. It narrows our conception of what and who we're afraid of. So like Malcolm X said so many years ago, the mainstream news has you afraid of certain kinds of people. At the same time, you're not taught to be afraid of other kinds of people who are actually causing you way more harm. So what do I mean by that? If you watch the news, you're sort of pushed to a variety of stories, whether it's about shoplifting and retail theft or carjacking or home invasions. You're pushed to be afraid of poor people, of people of color, particularly Black people. You look at the way mugshots of Black people have been used over the last few decades. You're taught to be afraid of immigrants, and you're taught to be afraid of strangers. This is really interesting because the bulk of interpersonal harm, violent crime, and sexual crime in the United States is not committed by strangers. It's committed by people who know each other. And a huge percentage, at least over a third of all stranger homicides in the US are committed by police. So this myth that like it's strangers on the street, typically poor, person of color, immigrant, that's the person to be afraid of, is a total myth, because the things that are most likely to harm us and our families, things like wage theft, that's $50 billion a year, that's 5 times all property crime combined in the United States, or tax evasion is $1 trillion a year, that's 60 times all property crime combined, or air pollution, water pollution. There's millions and millions and millions of intentional criminal acts of air and water pollution by people who own factories and companies, et cetera. Air pollution alone, I'm not even going to get into water, which is devastating for children all over the country, but air pollution alone kills 100,000 people in the US every year. So that's 5 times all homicide combined. And yet on the nightly news, you're not getting a nightly news story every night on which local neighborhood had a toxic cloud spewed over it by a company, or which local playground tested positive for lead in the soil where your child is playing. These are really important to safety, especially given the links between lead exposure and violence and violent crime in the future, right? But anyway, that's the first function, right? Narrowing the kinds of things and people we're afraid of. And then
And it ends up being so I mean, just to add to that, it's a deliberate distraction from the massive and perpetual and preventable harms that are being done. It's like, let me make you afraid of lightning while ignoring that every circuit in your house could electrocute you and kill you at any given moment. But be worried about that 1 in 12 million chance of being struck by lightning. The second thing you talk about is manufacturing fear. And I think you've already alluded to this right now, but you talked about how after the 2020 George Floyd protests, there was this massive rise in crime waves. I mean, notwithstanding that many of the riots that became violent was actually due to white supremacists infiltrating and creating that violence, something that police even later admitted to. But talk about the broader concept of manufacturing fear. What does this look like? How can folks recognize this when they see it next?
Yeah, so the second thing Copaganda does is, having narrowed our conception of what we're afraid of, it makes us constantly more and more and more and more and more afraid of that narrow range of things. It's why if you look at the polling over the last 25 years, every single year, people have said crime is up. And almost every single one of those years, crime was actually down.
Yeah.
To the point where we now have historically low crimes, like 50-year lows,
Yeah.
right? In the modern era. And instead, though, and this is something that I think is absolutely vital, if people only take one thing away from this episode, I want them to understand the volume of news and the selective curation of anecdote. What do I mean by that? What we feel most urgently about is hugely influenced by how many stories we see about it, and how that information is delivered to us. So for example, a few years ago, at the height of the initial panic about retail theft, there was one shoplifting in San Francisco that went viral. There was like a guy on a bicycle,
Yeah.
and it was a daring escape from Walgreens. That one story, that one video, tens of millions of views, it spawned 309 articles in local and national news outlets.
That's,
At the same time, no articles about wage theft by Walgreens itself, from its own workers. Okay,
yeah.
so if you see something a lot, you start to feel really urgently about it. You're getting push alerts on your phone. Gavin Newsom is now promising hundreds of millions of dollars to expand police prosecution and imprisonment for people accused of shoplifting. And here's the kicker: this happened at a time when shoplifting around the country was not up. We now know that. They've now admitted that. We now have all the information. And when property crime in general was at historic lows. So this volume of news created a false impression that shoplifting was up. How did it do that? And this is a really critical thing to understand. So if you ask me to tell someone about Michael Jordan, the basketball player who's never watched the NBA, I could make a video of every missed shot in Michael Jordan's career. It'd be like 10 hours long, just brick after brick after brick, missed shot after missed shot. I show this video to this person, they might conclude that this is not a very good basketball player. They might be like, this might be the worst player in NBA history. Why is he even here? He's missing all these shots. What I've done is I've used true examples, like that Walgreens theft was a true example of a theft, right? But I've used those true examples and I've juxtaposed them together to create a false impression that he's not a good basketball player. That's what the news media does with crime waves. That's what it did with retail theft. That's what it did with super predators with black children in the 1990s.
Right.
That's what it did with Willie Horton, if you remember that.
Yes. Ronald Reagan. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So like, and what a lot of people don't remember, it wasn't just that like the Bush campaign in the 80s found the Willie Horton story. There were 200 local news stories by this newspaper about Willie Horton.
Yeah.
And that newspaper was given the Pulitzer Prize by the liberal media establishment for its racist reporting. So what I try to expose in the book is there's all these, on any given night, there's millions of things that are happening in the world. And who is deciding which 8 or 10 things you're going to be told about on your nightly news? And what I try to expose in the book is there's this multi-billion-dollar world underneath all the news stories you're seeing, police public relations officials and others are determining which things you even know about and
Right.
which things you don't, and which things you're told about 10, 11, 12 times. And I think that's a really critical point to understand. That's how they manufacture fear, because at any given moment, you can make people more and more afraid through the sheer volume of times you tell them about certain types of crime.
We're speaking with Alec Karakatsanis, a leading civil rights lawyer, about his new book, Copaganda: How Police and the Media Manipulate Our News. And so having established that you have corporate media, you have legacy media, you have government officials narrowing our understanding of what the threat is, deflecting from these major threats, like pollution, like poverty, like wage theft. Then they manufacture fear on these narrow threats, and then the kind of the trifecta to bring it all home to perpetuate this injustice. You talk about how they promote punishment as the solution to this manufactured fear. Talk about what that looks like.
Yeah, so after getting everyone really afraid about this very narrow range of things and not even thinking about all the ways in which their lives are being cut short and harmed by more powerful people and institutions, they tell us that the solution to all of our fears is always more investment in the punishment bureaucracy,
Yeah.
which is really interesting, right? So the United States already spends way more money than any society in world history per capita on punishment, right? If more money on police, prosecution, and prisons made us safer, we'd have the safest society in the history of the world. But we don't. And the reason for that is this idea that more police, prosecution, and prison is the solution to interpersonal harm is like a modern day like flat earther movement.
Yeah.
It's like climate science denial. What we actually know from the evidence across the world and across US history is that the levels of harm in a society, the extent to which people hurt each other, is much more connected to basic facts about a society, like how unequal is a society? How much poverty is there? Do people have access to healthcare and mental health treatment? What is the state of early childhood education? Um, are young people being exposed to toxins like lead? What is the level of loneliness and isolation versus the level of community in a given society? Toxic masculinity. I could go on and on, but there are deep things that actually determine in a society how much violence there is. It has nothing to do with questions like uh, is the prison sentence for this crime 12 years or 7 years? Or are there 14 officers on patrol in this poor neighborhood or 17? Or, is this prosecutor's new charging policy a little bit more lenient than the last process? Like, so much of the news is focused on these little tiny tweaks within the punishment bureaucracy that they matter because a lot of people are making a lot of money off of them and they're helping the government surveil us and control us and crush social movements, but they actually have nothing to do with safety. And the whole
Yeah.
thing is sort of a giant lie.
And this is the argument I always make, that if we want to create a safer community, that happens by actually investing in public safety. Why are we empowering an agent of the state with the ability to use lethal force to address mental health issues, to address addiction issues, to address bullying issues? Why are we empowering people armed with the power to kill people with government backing as the solution to the societal ills that ail us? Why not invest in more mental health counselors? Why not invest in addiction treatment? Why not invest in suicide prevention? Why not invest in healthier environments for children? And because those things don't make capitalists money, those things don't make the billionaire class more money. But we're down to our last 5-6 minutes, Alec, and I want to cover two more quick things. One, we were talking off air about you mentioned that even with this book, you're kind of being blocked out by much of corporate media, much of legacy media. And to me, that's makes it even more important to have you on my show and elevate you on this platform, because the folks who listen to the show are extraordinarily conscious about social justice, about the need to be involved and engaged. And so if you're listening, make sure you share this. Make sure you go out and buy Alec's book. I got a free copy because I'm fortunate, but I'm going to go out and buy a free book and gift a book, because this is the kind of scholarship we need to spread. But what can folks do to get involved with your work, and just to ensure that we are creating a better narrative around this? Because what you've described is pretty overwhelming. I mean, we're talking about not just $1 billion industry, we're talking about $1 trillion industry that we're trying to counter for the sake of justice. What can folks, or what should folks be doing right now to start to play a meaningful role in bringing about a better sense of justice from what we're seeing right now?
Well, I'm really grateful to you for having me on. And also, I just want to note that I don't make any money from the book. All of the royalties go to charity, to an incredible organization that works with unhoused people in Skid Row in Los Angeles to
Amazing.
fight against police surveillance and brutality.
Incredible.
And also, just like with my last book, Usual Cruelty, we have free copies for anybody in prison and free copies for any teacher that wants to like use the book in any of their lessons with their students. So for, your students can have free copies. Um, high school, college, law school, graduate school. So when you do purchase a book, you're also just supporting really great work. It's not like anyone's profiting off of this. And the publisher is also a nonprofit. So this is not like an attempt to like it's an attempt to get these ideas out there.
Yeah.
And something you said a minute ago, just before I get to resisting Copaganda, which is I think a very important last chapter in the book. Um, the first step is just being able to recognize and critically read the news. So like all these things that you were just talking about, in spite of the propaganda goes so much deeper than we really acknowledge.
Yeah.
So you still have all of these, like in after Tyree Nichols was killed in Memphis, for example, there was all this focus on the Scorpion unit and this violent squad, right? And Eric Adams in New York was talking about, well, because he was bringing back, the equivalent squads in New York, and all these police departments across the country have these squads. And in the news media coverage of all of that, they made it seem like they actually they reported that the purpose of these squads was to fight crime, was to stop drugs and things like that. The media plays such a huge role in kind of brainwashing us because it reports these stated motivations of people in power as their actual motivations.
Yeah.
So, you read all these articles now about increasing prison sentences to stop the fentanyl epidemic, but it's like nobody in power actually thinks that increasing the prison sentence from 7 years to 19 years is the way to reduce fentanyl use. Nobody actually thinks that these violent undercover squads in poor neighborhoods alone are actually going to reduce crime. Like, there's no evidence for that. Nobody believes it. It's not actually why they're doing it. It has much more to do with real estate developers and gentrification and inequality and racism and these deeper features of our society. But the first line of propaganda is always hiding from us that there's a much more complicated story behind why these policies exist. And the news every single day, even with just simple sentences like Eric Adams saying, we did broken windows policing, or the news saying broken windows policing was an attempt by the NYPD to reduce crime. Like, that is false. That's not why broken windows policing existed. Anyway, I think it's critical as a first step that I talk about in the book to engage with other people because you can't do this alone.
Yeah.
The magnitude of the propaganda is so significant that none of us, not even me, who tried to write a little book about this, I
Yeah.
find myself constantly succumbing to it. That's why I surround myself with people who hold me accountable, who help me think differently, help think critically. So start a book club, do some reading. There's people writing me from prisons and from schools and from places all over the country saying we want to start our own little reading group to like identify local propaganda in our news. I think a really important thing is just starting to help each other think more critically about how we consume information. And
I,
then,
I
go
just
ahead.
before you continue, because I know I cut you off, but I have to read this quote from you in the book that just applies to this so well. I just love this. This is a sentence I read 3 or 4 times. When you talk about fortifying our own minds, you write that one thing I have learned is that the most effective strategy at all times and in all places, in court, in politics, and in life, is centering your heart with the most vulnerable people and animals and ecosystems, and then relentlessly telling the truth about what you see. It's such a simple truth, but it's such a powerful truth, right? I mean, centering your heart with the most vulnerable. I any person of any faith or no faith can buy into that, can genuinely embrace that. And those who have difficulty doing that are kind of the problem, if you ask me, right? Those who have an aversion to centering the vulnerable, I mean, to me, that's like a red flag that, well, that's kind of why we exist, to ensure we're elevating those who are downtrodden, who are vulnerable, and by centering them and then relentlessly telling the truth. And I think that's the part where it can be difficult for a lot of folks because they might be afraid of losing a job. I mean, this is unrelated, not directly related to the topic, but it is, as we talk about what's happening with the genocide in Gaza. People they can recognize it, but I've had no shortage of folks say, if I talk about this, I lose my job. This is going to be a very similar environment, right? Suddenly you're anti-police, suddenly you're pro-crime, suddenly you're pro-violence. How do you get to a point of of relentlessly telling the truth, knowing full well there could be consequences to you for speaking up for vulnerable and marginalized communities?
I don't want to purport to give anybody any advice about what risks to take in their own life. I mean, I'm a white male lawyer from Harvard, you know.
Yeah,
Um, I run a civil rights organization. Obviously, I get attacked a lot, and there's a lot of I've been detained and I've been threatened by the police, but I'm relatively safe, right? So, um, I don't want to say that I can, you have to do this or you have to do that, but I think whenever and wherever you can, it's really important, in my opinion, to always think about how um how and what you can do to help the people in our society who are the most vulnerable. And sometimes that means countering in the narratives that are told about those people in the news media.
right.
Because I would say, and this is a little bit crude, but I think it's mostly true. One of the main purposes of the mainstream news, and certainly its coverage of what they call public safety, is to get all of us feeling okay about enormous brutality, senseless brutality that is actually not making us safer. And its job is to make us kind of be okay with really terrible things that are happening to the most vulnerable people in our society in jails and prisons and courtrooms all across the country, even though everyone involved understands that it's actually not linked with any evidence to actual safety. So, how do you distract so many people from policies like universal health care and housing and early childhood education, like things that would actually transform our society? Well, you have to make them really, 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 really afraid. And
Yeah,
so, relentlessly telling the truth involves anytime you feel safe to do it, learning about it, confronting it, challenging it, saying no, like it is not okay that we have all of these children in cages across the country. It is not okay that we're separating parents from their children because they can't pay cash bail. It is not okay that people are being sexually and physically assaulted in prison cells all over this country with no accountability. Like these are the kinds of things. It is not okay that the Scorpion Squad is killing Tyree Nichols. Like, and the moment we lose our ability as a society to say no and to say 2 + 2 = 4, the moment they get us, afraid into going along with 2 + 2 = 5, like
yeah.
children don't have a right to hug their parents. It's okay what the police did to Tyree Nichols. Like the moment you lose that core
Humanity.
truth,
Yeah.
it's all over.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more, Alec. It's been such a brilliant conversation. In the final minute, can you share with our audience how folks can follow you and support your work and get involved?
Yeah, so I mean, please consider getting the book Copaganda as well as Usual Cruelty, my first book, which is really an introduction into how the criminal legal system actually works. And and then you can get that anywhere books are sold. If you go to the directly to the publisher, the New Press, you can use the code TNP30, like the New Press 30, TNP, and you can get 30% off the book. So
Amazing.
um, also if you're a teacher or someone who works with people in prison, you can write to me separately at our website, civilrightscorps.org. And you can ask me and we can get you free books. Also on social media, I'm at Equality Alec and on Substack as well, Alec's Copaganda newsletter. So yeah, just hopefully you'll be interested enough to get the book and start a book club and talk about it with people in your life because these are ideas that are not really making their way into the mainstream news media. And I think they're really important for us developing a more critical understanding of how so many of us are brought along with such unequal and unjust and unfair systems when we could have something so much different, so much better, so much more easily.
Alec Karakatsanis, award-winning civil rights lawyer, author of Copaganda, How Police and the Media Manipulate Our News. Alec, thank you for being with us today. We hope to have you back on soon.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're listening to the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View, channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back. You're listening to the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View, channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. If you're listening on Substack, make sure you hit that subscribe button. And, none of my content is behind a paywall. It's all accessible to you. You can subscribe for free or for a cup of coffee a month, but it goes a long way towards helping me uphold justice and bring on scholars like Alec to have these critical conversations. So thank you to those who are subscribing. By the way, I checked, we're now past 131,000 activists subscribing to us. So make sure you hit that button and join the party. I want to close by talking about Robert Francis Prevost, now known as Pope Leo XIV. Obviously Pope Francis passed away last month, and there was some I didn't agree with the Pope. There's a lot I did agree with the Pope, Pope Francis, and I'm hoping that Pope Leo XIV follows in his footsteps. At the top of the hour, I talked about Pope Leo has some really brilliant stances and some not so great ones. And I wanted to do a deep dive because I'm a nerd who went through his entire Twitter history. And it sounds like a lot. It is an old history. It goes about 10, 12 years, but he doesn't tweet that much. So let's kind of dive in. Let's talk about death penalty. Pope Leo has made clear that his staunch opposition to the death penalty is grounded in his faith. He tweeted on March 15th, 2015, simply stating, quote, "It's time to end the death penalty." And to me, this reflects his firm belief that state-sanctioned executions are not only morally indefensible, but just contrary to the basic essence of justice. I've written on this extensively about how the death penalty doesn't actually make anybody safer, doesn't save money, doesn't bring closure. It's deeply flawed because about 11% of people executed are later proven to be innocent the entire time. That's how flawed it is. And so the Pope saying this, it's a stance that aligns with global recognition that capital punishment is just a violation of human rights. It disproportionately impacts marginalized communities here in the US, Black and brown communities, low-income communities. A rich person has never been executed by the state, just to make clear how disproportionately it harms working people and low-income people. And the Pope calling for its abolition is a reminder that justice should be restorative, not retributive, and certainly not revengeful as well. Let's talk about immigrants. The Pope is committed to immigrants and refugees. He's, for years, I found a tweet from 2015 again, why Donald Trump's anti-immigrant rhetoric is so problematic. Him publicly denouncing Donald Trump. His visible support includes that of Syrian refugees. On January 27th, 2017, he reposted James Martin, the famous, I think he's not a cardinal, he's a bishop, maybe, Bishop James Martin. I'm not up on my Catholic lingo the way I should be. But when, he tweeted a photo of the Syrian refugee child all battered and beaten, and he says, quote, "We're banning all Syrian refugees, the men, women, and children who most need help. What an immoral nation we're becoming, Jesus weeps." And it wasn't just during the Trump administration, right? Prior to Trump's election, even during his administration, he made clear that we cannot support the caging of children, that it is unchristian and un-American to do so. He's openly called out J.D. Vance as recently as February, saying J.D. Vance is wrong. Jesus doesn't ask us to rank our love for others. This is rejecting Vance's restrictions on compassion for immigrants. And so, at a time when immigrants are being demonized left and right, the Pope's voice on these issues is a critical, a compassionate and courageous call for justice. And I'm grateful for it. Gun violence. Back in 2017, after the horrific Las Vegas massacre, Senator Chris Murphy tweeted, "To my colleagues, your cowardice to act cannot be whitewashed by thoughts and prayers. None of this ends unless we do something to stop it." And Robert Prevost, of course, now Pope Leo, retweeted that. And that's powerful because it shows that he recognizes that gun violence cannot be stopped by thoughts and prayers. So the Pope recognizes that thoughts and prayers are not enough, and I think that's compelling and important. Let's talk about racial justice, because this is an area where we're seeing the attacks on DEI, the attacks on Black Americans, the attacks on immigrants, the attacks on Latino Americans. And Pope Leo has been staunchly in favor of racial justice. Way back in 2014, he tweeted out a celebration of the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination during the George Floyd protests, which we just got done talking about with Alec in the previous interview. He retweeted Bishop Burbridge, who tweeted, "We continue to pray for Mr. George Floyd and his family. In his honor, and as we prepare for the Pentecost, we ask the Holy Spirit to unite us and heal our wounds. May all hatred, violence, and prejudice be eradicated, so that we may live in harmony and in the peace of our Lord Jesus." And he went on to the same day to tweet that we need to hear more from church leaders in the church to reject racism and to seek justice. So again, to me, this is an important indication that he recognizes the humanity of all people, and he's going to fight for racial equity and equality. Climate justice. We know that the previous Pope was a scientist, and Pope Leo is no different. Back in 2017, he urged Donald Trump to read Pope Francis's writings on climate change and calling for immediate action to protect the environment. This is way back on June 1st. And then he's also recognized that religion and science are not enemies. He retweeted in 2015 a tweet from Crux about the, quote, grand tradition in the church of clergy who are also scientists. And so you've got a Pope who recognizes that prayers are not enough, that we need action, who recognizes that science is an intimate and critical part of our life. And especially as we're dealing with this current anti-science administration that is dismantling critical regulations, dismantling the FDA, dismantling the NIH, dismantling the CDC, using junk science to claim that there's some connection between vaccines and autism. One can only hope that Pope Leo might influence someone in the Trump regime to reverse course and instead re-embrace actual science-based policy. Now, all that said, I'm going to keep it 100. While Pope Leo is on the right, on the just, and on the moral side of so many of these critical human rights issues, his stance on abortion and on reproductive justice is deeply problematic. It's deeply flawed. It's contrary to proven life-saving measures. It harms the safety of women and children. He's repeatedly called to defund critical life-saving reproductive health care, both on the state level by asking Governor Pritzker to veto an abortion funding bill, and on the federal level by calling on the HHS to rescind requiring Catholic employers to provide contraceptives to their employees. Look, I've written about this extensively before. It's well documented. Every global study ever done on abortion bans has proven one thing, that they do not actually save lives. They increase dramatically by 20 to 30% maternal mortality. They increase dramatically infant mortality. We're seeing this in Texas after SB 8, after this abortion ban, a spike in infant mortality of children born and then dying significantly at higher rates. And those who are born and not dying are much higher rates of poverty as well. It's no accident that 9 of the top 10 states with the highest infant and maternal mortality rates are red states that ban or restrict reproductive health access, while 9 of the top 10 states with the lowest rates of infant and maternal mortality are blue states that enable and afford reproductive health access. And so the Pope is wrong on this, and I'm hopeful he will listen to science and change his stance. Now, finally, before I close out, where does the Pope stand on Palestine and the genocide being inflicted by the Netanyahu regime? We know that Pope Francis called Gaza's Catholics every night at 7 p.m. I wasn't able to find any remarks by Pope Leo on this genocide, and my hope is that he follows in the footsteps of his predecessor and loudly condemns this injustice. Pope Francis also openly condemned Islamophobia and spoke up for Muslims being persecuted. He spoke up for Islam as a great religion of peace and justice. I couldn't find anything from Pope Leo, but I'm hopeful again he follows Pope Francis' example. Look, the bottom line is, I think overall Pope Leo has bold stances on issues like racial justice, like climate action, on ending the death penalty, ending gun violence, and he should be commended for that. His unwavering support for immigrants and refugees is powerful. It's a testament to his compassion and justice, and I'm hopeful that his commitment to science can impact this anti-science regime in the White House. I'm also hopeful that he changes his views on abortion and becomes somebody more committed to justice in that space. My friends, thank you for tuning in. It's been great to have your support today. Be sure to follow us on social media at Qasim Rashid across all platforms. We will continue to advance the show that builds on compassion and justice and accountability for those in power. If you're listening on Substack, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We've got a great show lined up for next week. Be sure to tune in, same time, same place. If you want to listen to it live at 10 a.m. Eastern on Sunday on Sirius XM channel 126. Otherwise, hit that subscribe button on Substack. My friends, be fierce, lead with compassion and justice, and continue speaking truth to power. Until next week, peace.